One of the main aims of the project, as Stefan was saying, was also to draw all sorts of policy implications about how to finance large-scale transformations and specifically for the green transition, right? So one of the things that we were thinking about is how can we actually use all these OBFAs, what can we actually do with them in order to make the green transition easier to finance. And we kind of took very much seriously some of the I guess quips that some people made, that if we want to think about the green transition, we should put our economy on a war footing, right? We should think about mobilizing resources, or a lot of this sort of militaristic language. And we said, okay, we're going to take you seriously, and we're going to look at how people in the past financed wars and post-war reconstruction, and we're going to try to draw implications and lessons for the green transition based on that. So despite the title, despite everything I'm going to tell you in the next 15 minutes, this is a paper about the green transition, right? Just looking at it through the eyes of Britain in the Second World War. And while that might not necessarily be the most explicit way of seeing this presentation now, I think Verena in the next presentation will make it even clearer how you can think about the green transition through the lens of war finance and post-war finance. So I'm going to take you back on a journey in Britain during the Second World War, looking at one pretty obscure, I suppose, OBFA, the Exchange Equalization Account, and I'm going to hopefully persuade you that this was used not just for financing the war, but really for transforming the monetary architecture of Britain at the time of the Second World War in a sort of significant way. So let's go, right? So when you think about how states finance wars and really how public finance happens on a large scale basis, normally the literature talks about three different pillars, right? So they talk about taxation, about borrowing, and about money creation. And we do have a lot of literature about how this happens, right? What happens to taxation historically during periods of large scale transformation, what happens to borrowing, how these instruments actually lead to all sorts of processes of state formation and all sorts of consequences for progressive taxation, for instance, or for expanding the capacity of the state to raise money. We also have a lot of literature about money creation, especially in a sort of negative way, because this is usually perceived as leading to inflation and inflationary processes that are maybe catastrophic. But what we argue here is that this literature doesn't actually look very much at other institutions. This only looks at the so-called apex institutions, so treasuries that issue sovereign debt or war loans, right? Or central banks that do the sort of monetary creation. But they don't really look at other mechanisms that are not necessarily visible in these sort of apex accounts. So this misses the off-balance sheet equation. And we argue that off-balance sheets really should be looked at because they contain within themselves more hidden fiscal capacity, right? And we see that historically, so initially when we thought about the UK case study, we thought that, this might be a negative case study because in the UK, there's this whole literature about treasury control, right? So the treasury in the UK is very, very disciplining upon government spending, right? So it intervenes in sort of departmental spending, and it always has managed to exert a very strong control upon government spending. But even in the UK, we discovered that there are actually institutions that bypass this sort of control of the treasury and are able to raise more funds, or in some cases, create even more money or lending practices that go beyond these apex institutions. Okay, so for a little bit of context, in the run-up to the Second World War, we had, of course, the Great Crash of 1929. We had the Great Depression. We had the states were not necessarily in the best place financially. In the UK, for instance, there was a lot of borrowing happening after the First World War, so the UK was still saddled with a lot of borrowing. It could always raise more funds through borrowing, and it did so during the war, but nonetheless, there was a specific limit, even though you might think that it's a sort of self-imposed limit. Taxation already increased by quite a lot during the interwar period, and after the First World War. Could be raised again further, of course, but the policymakers thought that they should, probably not do that very much because they still needed the consent of people for mass mobilization, money creation. There was a sort of hangover from the First World War when this led to quite a bit of inflation. These sort of apex institutions were constrained. There was also the issue of foreign exchange, because Britain, even though it was still a sprawling empire by then, it was still importing a lot of its goods from America, North America, and South America, so it needed actual dollars. It needed gold as well, so it needed a lot of hard foreign currency, and this proved to be quite a big problem. So Treasury officials started thinking about, okay, what can we do? Are there any sort of resources that we can muster in order to mobilize for the war? And they came up with the realization that there is one institution that we have here, the Exchange Equalization Account, that was established a little bit earlier as a sort of very technocratic fund to manage currency fluctuation, but through a little bit of sort of tinkering, improvisation, and innovative thinking, let's say, it managed to actually repurpose it into something much bigger. So, for a bit of context about the Exchange Equalization Account, this was founded in 1932, so this was right after Britain came off of the gold standard in 1931. So here is a chart that looks at what happened to the exchange rate after Britain jumping off the gold standard in 1931, collapsed by 25%. So policymakers thought, okay, we need some sort of institution to check these sort of what they called undue fluctuations in sterling, right? So a lot of speculation regarding the value of sterling. So they came up with the Exchange Equalization Account, which was really just a sort of fund that parked all sorts of foreign exchange and gold reserves just to use for managing these sort of currency fluctuations. The Treasury technically retained ultimate control upon the Exchange Equalization Account, but really it was the Bank of England that served as operational agent. And one of the very important things about the Exchange Equalization Account was that it was kind of hidden, right? So policymakers did not want to talk about it. It was explicitly created as a hidden sub-balance sheet of the Treasury because they didn't want to. They didn't want to give the impression that they're interfering in the markets, right? So, So by September 1939, already more than 10% of GDP of Britain's GDP was accumulated in these sort of resources, and here on the lower right-hand side, you can see some of the how we try to think about what the Exchange Equalization Account was doing at the time. So we started mapping these sort of transactions that it was doing. So there we go. One of the first things that the Exchange Equalization Account was doing, for instance, was when you had a capital inflow, and there were all sorts of pressures upon the currency, then the Exchange Equalization Account would sell treasury bills, would get deposits, so sterling deposits, and then it would sell these deposits. So as I don't know if people in the back might not be able to see that, but what it says there really is just that minus GBP deposits gets foreign currency, gives these deposits to a commercial bank in exchange for foreign currency, so that's one of the ways in which it stemmed pressures from an inflow of foreign capital, and it did the reverse operation when there was a capital outflow, and there were the sort of opposite pressures upon the EEA. So this was the sort of vanilla transactions that the exchange equalization account was doing, simply to just manage the currency when you did not have the gold standard anymore. Right. Well, what was very interesting to see, so we did a lot of archival work on this, and we discovered that as soon as the war came, policymakers started giving the exchange equalization account new powers. And we divide this powers within 3 different categories. The first category is this one of the asset requisitioning. So these were given by the defense regulations in September 1939, so exactly at the beginning of the war, which meant essentially that the EEA could say, you have assets, I take assets, I do what I want with assets, right? So this was kind of the first asset requisitioning thing. And this is divided usually into two different transaction modalities, I guess the vesting orders, in which the EEA would basically take the foreign currency securities of residents. So if you are a British resident and you had securities in dollars or in Canadian dollars or in other currencies, you would be forced to sell it to the EEA. Here we go. And the EEA would give you sterling deposits at what it considered was the market value. And as you can imagine, market value was not really the market value. It was a sort of market value. So that's how it managed to get more than 300 million pounds in hard currency, just by forcing people to sell these foreign currencies. The other one was blocking regulations, which was directed towards foreign holders of sterling assets. So the fear was that foreign holders of sterling assets would sell their sterling assets and drain the hard currency that existed within the system. So it essentially took all of these sterling assets that existed within British banks and just blocked them. So it said, okay, you can't take them now. Maybe in the future, once the war is over, we'll give them to you then. So the foreign resident would end up with an asset, which was really just a claim upon the EEA. The second type of operations was a more complex one, which had to do with trade, with international trade. So Britain at the time was still very much a trading superpower, and specifically during the war, there was a lot of trade with its colonies, and Britain was importing a lot of raw materials, especially useful for the war effort. And what it essentially said was that all of these trade surpluses that you are building with me will stay in the accounts of the EEA for an indeterminate period as well, right? So you are a foreign exporter, you export your goods, you get British pounds, then these go to the exchange equalization account at the Bank of England, and the exchange equalization account creates a claim for you. So you have a claim upon the exchange equalization account for the future that you're going to get your sterling deposits. You can't use it now. What you can do with it, there are some exceptions. So you could use it within the sterling area to buy specific goods from the sterling area so that it doesn't impose any sort of pressures upon the currency, or you can buy British Treasury securities. That was one type of operation. Another type of operation was related to the United States and Switzerland, which were important trading partners at that time. So they were able to use their sterling deposits to engage in foreign exchange, but only through specific banks. And finally, a more complicated one was that it also started, the exchange equalization account also started behaving as a derivative trader, right? So you have all these claims upon the EEA to be redeemed in the future. So how do you make sure that you get the right value for them? So then the EEA started engaging in derivatives trading, and it guaranteed a specific amount for the future. Now, the funny thing is that because all this was kind of hidden, so there was no way to actually check how the accounts were actually doing at that point. It was sort of a state secret. The British state really accumulated all these massive liabilities, and it started kind of using them, right? So you can see in this very, very small chart here, you can't see, but this is the sort of liabilities that it had, and this is the assets that were supposed to actually fulfill those liabilities, because Britain was actually drawing down in all of these.
You can zoom in if you
I can zoom in. That's fine. I'll just.
Interesting time, though.
I'll just leave it more mysterious like that. Okay, so the final one was lending. So because Britain wanted to pursue this war on a 3% interest rate, as you can imagine, not a lot of money was forthcoming when you're at war and you want to borrow with 3%, right? So it had to actually get more money for for purchasing its government debt, and it did so from the EEA as well. So the EEA was doing all sorts of operations that we've already discussed, and then it started buying government bonds, and literally it was a sort of it was not really a monetary funding, but it was a monetary financing, but it was a sort of monetary financing because it was directly funding this. And another thing that it was doing was that it was using all these surpluses that it accumulated within its accounts to go ahead internationally, for instance, to the US or to Canada, to use these assets as collateral to borrow. So it borrowed from the US Reconstruction Finance Corporation, for instance, 400 million pounds, and then from Canada as well, 700 million pounds, just by using all these things as collateral.
Well, Andrei just explained to you how to finance the green transition through how to finance a war, or basically how we can find out with our case studies how states have historically financed large-scale transformations in the past. However, one thing that we do not talk about a lot is what actually happens afterwards. So once the financing is done, once the war is over, when we think about like things that maybe have to become smaller, like, for example, fossil fuel industries in today's day and age, how do we actually deal with this kind of last step of what we have framed as like macro-financial governance process? How do we deal with balance sheets contracting? Historically speaking, oftentimes not very well. Oftentimes we don't contract at all. We just go and try to push into the next stage of financing and expanding credit systems. But what actually happens when that isn't possible, and what does it mean for the different actors which are involved in this kind of thing? As Andrei said, we look at war finance and we try to sort of find something out for the green transition case. In this case, what we are actually trying to draw here is a parallel with asset stranding. So shutting down fossil fuel industries, or some industries just becoming unprofitable because of the consequences of climate change and so on and so forth. And we look at the war that has accumulated after, or during World War I as an example for this. Basically, we look at all three types of war, not all three, there were probably more, but we look at three different types of debt. We look at the German domestic war debt, we look at the reparation payments, and the debt that accumulated between the allies, so the winners of the war. Well, they also had to pay for the war, what happened in there, and how are these things connected. So, what do we find out? Front-loading our results for the sake of time. We have identified 4 different ways in which usually, or at least in this case, contraction is being managed. One of them being the most straightforward one, contraction by fulfillment. Debt is repaid. Everything's fine. Everyone is happy. Second one being contraction by cancellation. So that means that either part or all of the debt is written off during processes of either two-sided process of debt forgiveness, or oftentimes also cases of default. We also find 2 more possibly inspiring or more unusual ways of contracting balance sheets, which is the first one is, we call it contraction by oblivion. And contraction by oblivion is very interesting because it de facto removes debt from the balance sheet while not necessarily doing so in a legal sense. Basically what happens is that the debt is still there, the liability still exists, but both the creditor and debtor have somehow decided, Well, just pretend it's not. Because, you know, if no one claims that you owe them money and you don't pay by yourself, well, then it's a mutual agreement that it's gone at some point at least. And how this plays out in reality, I'm going to show you briefly later on. Second kind of more spicy way of debt forgiveness or getting rid of your liabilities is contraction by redenomination. I think this is Armin's personal favorite. And it is a change of the unit of account to reduce your debt burden. This only works if you have some sort of possibility to change the unit of account. So usually, for example, a state, when they do a currency reform, when they change the value of the currency, then this sort of affects many claims on the balance sheet, but usually not all of them. And then if it does so in a different way for the assets and the liabilities, well, then you end up with a different debt structure. So this contraction by redenomination is basically what happened at the end with the domestic war debt. Whereas with the reparation payments, what we find out is that most of it at the end of the day was cancelled. And with the Interallied War debt, they were this kind of like ominous type of contraction by oblivion. We also, when looking at this, we sort of over the time of writing this paper, we found out that this is really a very political process. And I think oftentimes our balance sheets get sort of like criticized for being a structuralist or functionalist approach. And how if you look at these things and if you look at like assets and liabilities and money and whatever, you know, where are the actors? Like where's the agency? But actually what we find out in this case study is that the question of who loses out, how fast, who actually can get their claims, their monetary claims fulfilled, and who can get debt renegotiated, who can get debt cancelled, all of these questions are highly political processes, and they are negotiated, they are resisted, and oftentimes, well, they are improvised. So I don't think that contraction by oblivion, for example, was something that anyone actually came up with. It was just the outcome of people not being able to find a compromise. So this is sort of what we are trying to stress, that with like looking at these kind of events through a balance sheet lens, you actually find out how through the process of assets, well, everyone's asset always being someone's liability and vice versa, you see how through these connections, the actions of different actors, they sort of shape each other. And I'm going to focus specifically on the role of German war debt, because I think it's the one where we have sort of, at the end of the day, figured out the political processes that are happening here and how these like balance sheets end up actually telling a very political story. Basically, what happened was that the German state got into a lot of debt during the World War. Obviously, you know, you all probably know, especially the ones coming from Germany here, probably all know these like old propaganda posters of how they were like trying to finance the war. Something very similar happened in the US and the UK. And this debt was basically, they tried to fulfill it, but because at some point, the reparations payments also got on top of it. There was some, well, basically you can argue, okay, were the Germans able to repay these debt before or not? But once there was also the Treaty of Versailles and the reparation payments on top of that, it became sort of very clear, okay, well, both of these things are definitely not going to happen. At least that is something that became very clear to the German public and to the owners of these claims. And basically what we have seen then was that, what am I going to focus on now that I have a 2-minute warning? Good. What we've seen is that there was a conflict of interest in like the German debt holders and the allies, obviously. And the German debt holders, especially in the moment that the Allies decided, okay, the Germans are not paying enough reparations. They were actually occupying the Ruhr area to get some fulfillment through by force. what happened was that the German public did this sort of like passive resistance. They were kind of trying to strike they were striking and so on and so forth. And they did that because they wanted their debt claims fulfilled, right? But what ended up happening was that this caused hyperinflation. And because of the hyperinflation, the German state ended up being forced to do a currency redenomination, which effectively wiped out the claims of the domestic war bond owners rather than the claims of the allies. So this is one of the examples where you can really see this kind of worst case scenario of how this politically plays out for one of the actors. I'm going to skip over the reparation debt because this is also going to be something that we're going to look at afterwards. But also with the Interallied War Debt, what we are seeing here very clearly is that, well, the allies themselves were very heavily indebted, in particular with the United States, but also amongst each other, UK being an interesting case of being both a creditor and debtor. And from the perspective of the allies, the reparation payments, at least part of it, were necessary for them to be able to fulfill their own claims. And this is also one of the main reasons why, when we look at the reparation payments, we can see that they are not willing to waive those debts. They know that Germany is probably not able to repay their debt, but they are constantly asking the United States, can you please first forgive this debt so that we can then later on do so for Germany? And the United States government is very aware of this situation, but it refuses to recognize this sort of connection. And it's very apparently it's very ununderstandable for the British at the time why the United States doesn't want to do this. But for us, if we look at the balance sheets, it's very clear because, well, that would mean that the US public would have had to pay for the war that happened in Europe. Because at the end of the day, they would have been the ones, well, left with the final claims, right? So basically, what we're seeing in the case of the Interallied War Debt is, in particular, this sort of how these different diverging interests are playing out in a way where there's no solution that can be found. And then, as I've sort of like told you at the very beginning, we do see how, through the fact that at the end of the day, the Germans are not really able to repay, then the allies stop paying their debt with the United States. At the end, the US ends up waiving these debts de facto, but it never waived the debt legally. And what happened is that we sort of entered this stage where we don't really know where the debt ends up being. We have decided in our portrait that it's a shift of balance sheet, but actually, well, somewhere in the United States Treasury Department, there's probably still some notes saying, well, the British actually owe us a shit ton of money from World War I. And yeah, this actually comes up. Like sometimes, like in the 70s, they had a debate about this and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is basically what we found out, and you hopefully will understand why we think that this is an important, or that this shows us important lessons that we can draw from why maybe it's not that easy to actually strand assets in the terms of the green transition. Thank you very much, and I think we're going to take your questions together now. So.
Yeah, thank you very much.